thank everybody here from the last round for opening up for us on a Tuesday night. Because they do this just for us on a Tuesday. Otherwise, they would all be doing other things. So we're grateful that they're here and that they're willing to host us every month. And this is a great spot for it, and it's great that you're all here. This is another full house, and this is great. I'm just glad it's not -5, because it'd be an empty house probably. All right, so on with the program. So our presenter tonight, Nicole Danahar Garcia, graduated from Duke University with a Bachelor of Science degree in biology and a minor in environmental science. After completing 2 animal husbandry internships, Nicole became a volunteer with the Dolphin Communication Project, a nonprofit research organization focused on dolphin-to-dolphin acoustic, tactile, and visual communication. She completed a field internship in Bimini, the Bahamas, and has returned to Bimini each summer since, and has not invited any of us to join her. Nicole collaborated with DCP for her PhD work, which she completed at UMass Dartmouth with Richard Connor as her advisor. Her project focused on the social behavior of the Bimini spotted dolphins. She completed a postdoc at Florida International University and is now a research associate with DCP, the Dolphin Communication Project, as well as an assistant professor of data science at the Massachusetts General Hospital Institute of Health Professions in Boston. And luckily, she does not have to drive to that office every day and deal with that crappy traffic. She's also a member of the Science Cafe advisory team, and back in February of 2019, she led one of the learning station at the second Science Kids Cafe we hosted at the Wheeling Museum. Turns out she also designs the Science Cafe flyers. And with that, I give you Nicole Danahar Garcia.
Hello. I am not used to using a microphone, so I'll try not to be too quiet or too loud or anything. So thank you all for coming. It's very nice to see this room so full. As Bob said in his wonderful introduction, I completed my undergraduate studies at Duke University, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background about myself before I get into my dolphin story. So when I graduated, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I tried out these animal care internships because I was interested in animal behavior and training and all of that. While I was there, I got this book out of the library called Dolphin Mysteries, and in the preface, one of the authors mentioned Mystic Aquarium, which happened to be exactly where I was sitting when I read that sentence. So I went to my supervisor and I asked, "Do you know this person?" And she said, "Actually, yes, and she lives in Stonington, just nearby. Why don't you email her?" So I emailed this woman, who turned out to be Dr. Kathleen Dudzinski, the director of the Dolphin Communication Project, and I started volunteering. It also turns out that I had heard of Dr. Dudzinski well before this. When I was 11, I went to the Boston Aquarium, and at one of those IMAX shows, it was about this woman, and she swam underwater with this camera and like a scooter, and it was so cool, and she studied how dolphins talk to each other. So from then on, when people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I did not say marine biologist or dolphin researcher. I said, I want to be that person from that video. And 10 years later, I met her in person and I got to volunteer. So I spent a year volunteering in the office, learning how to process data and analyze and everything. And then I tried a field internship in Bimini, the Bahamas, and I have never left since. I go back every year. Our field season is from late April through early September. And it was there that I was on the boat one day. I vividly remember being on the boat, on the bow. My supervisor was up in the tuna tower, and we are able to identify the dolphins from the boat. So I'm looking at them, trying to figure out who was there, and I didn't recognize a single one. Not only did I not recognize them, they looked very weird. It would be like people coming here right now in bathing suits. You'd look at them like, what is wrong with those people? There's something different. But we didn't know what was going on. So I will get back to this, but this is what we call an intergroup interaction, and this large group of 46 unfamiliar dolphins moved into the area where we had been studying dolphins for the past 10 years. And it's very unusual. I'll get into why that is and what might have caused it, but just stepping back a little so you understand the context. As I mentioned, my field site is Bimini, the Bahamas. It is a very tiny family island, 50 miles off the coast of Miami. It lies directly adjacent to the Gulf Stream, so you can basically see the Gulf Stream from land. So that means the deep, productive water is very close for the dolphins, and we think that they go off into the deep water to forage at night. And then the shallow water around Bimini, which is the Great Bahama Bank, is perfect for them to rest and socialize and mate and play and do everything else that they have to do. So they really don't have to expend a lot of energy to do all of the things that they do and to succeed in life. And they also have a very large, shallow area, so that can often be a limiting resource for animals in the marine habitat is sheltered areas. So that's something to keep in mind. When we're in the field, we go out just for a day trip, so we don't have a live-aboard boat. We can go out and within an hour or less, we can find dolphins. And we'll go out for 4 to 5 hours. Once we find dolphins, we'll assess what they're doing and just kind of figure out if we're going to interrupt anything important or if they're going to ignore us and we can just observe their behavior. If everything seems fine and they're calm, we will get in the water and we collect still photos and video data. A lot of our trips are with field course students, so university students that come down and they'll do 1 or 2 weeks on Bimini, learning how we collect our data and how we analyze it and all of that. We also take out ecotourists, so normal folks who just want to have a slightly more educational vacation and learn about dolphins, they'll come down. So if we have interns or those university students or ecotourists who are interested in helping us, we'll give them a still camera and they'll take pictures of all the dolphins in the group. The primary researcher on the boat will get in the water with a fancy camera. It's called a mobile video acoustic array, and it has a camera in the center in an underwater housing, and then it has a microphone, an underwater microphone called a hydrophone on either side. They are 4.5 times farther apart than the distance between your ears. And we do that because sound travels 4.5 times faster underwater than it does in air. So when we are recording the underwater sounds and then we play them back on headphones with stereo sound, we are able to tell what direction the sound is coming from. So if we're lucky enough to get a single dolphin in frame and hear that the sound is coming from that direction, we can deduce that that is the dolphin who's making the sound. We use these photos to document who is in the group, and then we use our video data to figure out our behavioral stuff. So we have an archive from Bimini, but also different field sites where we collect data in exactly the same way so that we can compare between sites. We go in the water and we pick the first random dolphin that swims into view and follow them until they swim out of view. This is a very common data collection protocol for animal behavior studies. It's called a focal follow, and it allows you to get a better sense of the entire picture of what is happening to an individual rather than jumping from dolphin to dolphin. It also tries to reduce our personal bias. So we are scientists. We are not supposed to have favorites, but we do. So if I picked Romeo every time I went in the water because she's my favorite, then we would have a big sample and know a lot about what Romeo does when she's with her dolphin friends, but we would not have a very even random sample. So we try to just pick whoever happens to be in front of us. Also, if there are calves that are doing something energetic and fun, and adults that are swimming more sedately, we don't want to oversample anything. So, you might ask yourself how we can tell the dolphins apart. So the species that I study are called Atlantic spotted dolphins. I could quiz you about where they live and what they look like. We are very creative with our naming. They live throughout the temperate and tropical Atlantic. So they are found throughout the Bahamas, not just around Bimini, as well as along the South American coast and across the pond around the Azores and Portugal and all of that. But we do think that most populations are resident to their area, so they're not going to be making huge migrations or anything. Spotted dolphins are very special because they have individualized spot patterns. So kind of like your fingerprint, each individual dolphin has its own spot pattern, and it is different on both sides, so they're not a mirror image. The difference is that spotted dolphins are born without spots, and they accumulate them as they get older. So we do have to go out every single year and make sure that we're getting pictures of as many dolphins as possible so that we can keep track of what they look like as they get older. But the fact that they're born without spots also gives us an advantage because we're able to identify their age class just from visual, from afar. So even if we're not able to identify who that specific dolphin is, we can say, that's a juvenile and it's interacting with another juvenile, and then we can broadly speak to what juveniles are doing. Juveniles start to gather dark spots on their belly and their sides. As they move into the subadult phase, they'll continue to get those, but they start to get white spots on their back. And then adults are completely covered in spots. They're called fused because their spots are so close together that you can't tell one spot from the next. So let me just organize my thoughts here. Okay, yes, so out on the boat this day in 2013, when all of a sudden all these unfamiliar dolphins showed up, we were able to identify the fact that they were different because we can identify them by their spot patterns. Some also have scarring and stuff that we use. For a very long time, we did not know where these dolphins came from, or why they were there, or how many of them there were. But over time, a different group that has been studying Atlantic spotted dolphins in the northern Bahamas had published a paper, and they lost track of a huge number, almost 50 dolphins, that they just stopped seeing. So we thought, well, that seems like a good place to start. And using citizen scientists who donated their photos, we were able to confirm that every dolphin, every unfamiliar dolphin that came to Bimini came from this area. It's called the White Sand Ridge, and as I mentioned earlier, Bimini is on the Great Bahama Bank. White Sand Ridge is on the Little Bahama Bank to the north. It's only about 100 miles between White Sand Ridge and the beginning of the Bimini shallow area, but that's a really long way when you have to cross a really deep channel. So there's a channel that goes as deep as 2,000 feet, and the dolphins would have to cross that. And moreover, the Grand Bahama Island kind of blocks the channel, so they'd have to go out into the Gulf Stream and then cross. So if you can imagine, dolphins have a 3D environment that they have to watch out for. So when you're driving on the road, you're worried about your sides and the rear and what's in front of you, obviously. Imagine if you had to also pay attention to what's above you and what's below you and what might try to ambush you. So they avoid that as much as possible. They go into the deep water to forage because that's where the more productive water is, but they don't voluntarily spend a lot of time in the deep water. So we think that that is what has been keeping these two groups separate for so long. And we were able to confirm that the northern researchers never saw Bimini dolphins there in the 30 years that they had been studying this area. And the same thing, we had never seen any of those dolphins before. The dolphin group that we saw included adults, juveniles, subadults. It was males and females. It was very unusual. And you might ask yourself why that's unusual. Well, on land, for terrestrial mammals, group mixing is very strange. So usually you'll have a group where, there's individuals as they're born and start to mature, one sex will move to a different area to move to that group and, have their family over there. For most mammals, it's the male that migrates. For chimpanzees, it's the female. So the males stay and they are protecting their resources, which includes viable females, but their food and everything. And the females will go to a different place to mate and live out the rest of their life. We acknowledge that in the marine environment, it's very difficult to have a territory that you're going to defend because everything is moving. Their food source is not stationary. It's going to be prey that moves around in the Gulf Stream. They never know where it's going to be. So it is very difficult to be territorial. But as I had mentioned, the shallow area is something that they can defend. So in Hawaii, The spinner dolphins have the shallow bays where they will rest. They had previously seen only one instance of this in all of the literature, where they saw a large group of immigrants move into the area of a resident group of dolphins, and they saw so much aggression. It was the residents fighting with the immigrants to get them out of their resting bays. They only studied them for a year, so we don't really know what happened after that, but given what we know about terrestrial species and the dolphins around Midway, we assumed and expected that our dolphins were going to fight, or that we would at least see more aggression. Perhaps we would see some kind of fracturing in their social relationships. We expected to see something, and we didn't see any of it. In fact, we saw the complete opposite. In spotted dolphins, they have very long-term preferential bonds, typically between males, but these bonds are stronger than the female-calf relationship. They last decades. And they usually form from childhood, from when they're juveniles and they're spending time in the same group. We see them together consistently. So we used to think that these relationships needed all of that time to really solidify. But we saw strong bonds form between adult males from Bimini and White Sand Ridge, so across groups, in just the 6 years of my study, which is incredible. We also did not see any overt aggression. The only aggression that I recorded was a female that was getting chased by a male because he wanted to mate with her and she was like, get away from me, which happens between the Bimini dolphins all the time, so it wasn't unusual. We did not see any overt aggression, and we saw so much affiliative contact, which is very unusual, as I was saying, in terrestrial species, except for bonobos. They have a female-dominated society, so they are a little bit more peaceful when they come together for intergroup interactions. You'll see more affiliative contact, but they do have more aggression as well. And those group mixing events don't last as long. It might be a few days, a week, a month, but this has been over 6 years, and as far as we know, the White Sand Ridge dolphins are still around Bimini. So you might also wonder why this is important. The study of social behavior in general helps us broaden our understanding of social evolution. And I don't know if you've heard, but they theorize that the reason that Homo sapiens succeeded and Neanderthals didn't was because the Homo sapiens were able to cooperate with individuals outside of their family unit. So they were more successful because they cooperated to hunt, to protect themselves from predators, to do all of these things. If you're going to just limit yourself to who you're in your family with, that obviously you have fewer individuals to have eyes out for predators or fight them off and all of that. So I think that wraps up my story for now. I'm happy to take any questions about dolphins in general or specifically about my study. I could talk about this for hours, so yes. So the question was how old dolphins get. It depends on the species. So you might be familiar with dogs, where smaller dog breeds live longer than big dogs. It's actually the reverse in dolphins. So smaller dolphin species live shorter than bigger ones. Killer whales, which are the biggest dolphin species, live to 80, 90, 100 years. We know that bottlenose dolphins live approximately 40 to 60 years, depending on where in the world they are. And since spotted dolphins are slightly smaller, we assume that they live about 35 years. We have not been around Bimini long enough to track an individual from birth until their death. So that's why we have job security, but that's our best guess. Mm-hmm.
Nicole, would you also estimate that the females will live longer than the males because of the roles the females have with the young ones?
So the question was, would I assume that females live longer than males because of their role with the young ones, did you say?
Yeah, because once the males are done being sperm donors, they're kind of useless. In the dolphin world, some of them anyway, the aunties and the grandmas will all take care of them.
Yes, so there are some species, killer whales are a very special dolphin case, where they actually have menopause. So the females will stop reproducing and they'll still live, like typically in most mammalian species, why would you continue to live? And you know, you have to be provided with resources, or you have to help get resources. So they are thought to go into menopause because they're a good trough of information. So that happens with elephants as well. They know where historically there has been prey, where there are areas with predators. They are familiar, they've had their calves numerous times, they can help new moms. We don't think that happens with spotted dolphins. I have one case study to support it. The oldest dolphin that we know that we have seen for sure, her name was White Blotch. She had a calf and then had another calf while we were watching her, and that calf was 3 years old, which is approximately when they wean and they go off on their own. And then she was 4 and she was still with her mom, and she was 5, she was still with her mom. She was 6, she was still with White Blotch. And then we saw the calf by herself, and we never saw White Blotch again. So we think that was like her last moment, and because she had just had a calf, I can only assume that she didn't then move somewhere else to give them her information. Yes?
Just to have a visual, I looked at, Bimini dolphins, and they, on Wikipedia, which of course we know is not reliable, but they said that Bimini dolphins are bottlenose or spotted, but that the species are bottlenose and spotted. You're using it in terms of a different species?
So around Bimini, there are 2 species of dolphin. There are the bottlenose dolphins, which everyone is probably familiar with, and they look just like bottlenose that you would see anywhere else, but a little bit smaller. And then there are the spotted dolphins. In most places in the world where there are multiple species of dolphins, and one of those is the bottlenose, they know the most about the bottlenose, and they know the least about all the others. On Bimini and in the Bahamas, things often don't go as planned, and so we know a lot about the spotted dolphins and very little about the bottlenose. They are very aloof, they don't like to come to the boat, they don't really stick around when we get in the water with them. So, yes. Yes, Anne.
So, can you fill out your explanation why you think this happened a little bit more? And how can you research this more to make sure your hypothesis is correct?
Yes, so the question was why this happened and how we can research it to be more certain about it. So there are a few reasons that groups will come together. As I was saying about terrestrial mammals, they don't typically mix big groups. It's usually like 1 or 2 strange individuals that move into a new group. The exception to that is if their predation increases, their food decreases, or their adults have left the group. So one of the instances in the literature of a large group of chimpanzees coming together, it was because the group that entered the resident groups area had no adults. So presumably there's less competition because there are no adults that are reproductively viable. But otherwise, if there are more predators, it's better for everybody if you get over your differences and just cooperate. If there's less food and you need to have more eyes out and everything. So we did look at chlorophyll patterns around White Sand Ridge and Bimini. And there was a little bit of a shift around White Sand Ridge, but it was not enough to convince me that there was any shift in their prey. Moreover, if the food that they're getting is from the Gulf Stream, it's very unlikely that any chlorophyll shifts around White Sand Ridge are affecting that, because all of the water is coming up from the south. It's all cold and productive. It's probably going to be bringing it, and it's going to be the same cold productive water that goes right by Bimini. So that hypothesis was out. We also looked into the predators, and there's a place called the Shark Lab on Bimini, where they have been studying sharks in the Bahamas for the past 30 years. They found no evidence of any type of shift in predator abundance. In White Sand Ridge, there are a ton of tiger sharks. That's around where Tiger Beach is. But we did not find any evidence of a huge increase in sharks. It would have to be a pretty large like a pretty significant change in predator abundance for it to cause this shift. The other reason we looked into is perhaps there were fewer mates. The population in White Sand Ridge had about 125 dolphins, and then this giant group of about 50 left. Their population was actually increasing. Their operational sex ratio, meaning the mates that you actually could mate with, so not a female who has a calf or who's pregnant, was not low. And it was kind of the same as when they came down to Bimini. It was the same when they were in White Sand Ridge. Bimini was the same before they arrived, and then they arrived and it was pretty much the same then. So mates don't seem to be a driver either. Another hypothesis is that people might have caused this. So obviously we go out on an eco-tour boat. We are not the only people who are interested in swimming with dolphins. Around Bimini, there are only 2 other permitted boats that can go out with tourists. There are many other people who come without a permit to swim with the dolphins. But around Bimini, we do not allow anybody to touch them. You're not allowed to directly interact with them. If they come up to you to look at you, you can look at them. But around White Sand Ridge, they're allowed to touch. They also do they play with them. They'll bring scarves into the water and they'll kind of play, like they'll toss it back and forth. Or if there's a piece of seaweed, they'll toss it back and forth with the dolphins. So perhaps that was interfering with the dolphins' life. Maybe there were too many human boats out there and they got fed up and they left. That we are not able to look into because we don't know, we weren't out there before and after. We don't know how many boats there were, if it had changed significantly at all. So I don't have an answer to that question. And I honestly don't know that we would ever be able to have a solid answer to the question.
You said that the group that was there when the 50 left was about 100, so half of them left.
Mm-hmm.
How big was your group, and typically how big are groups of dolphins?
So the question was, how big was our group before the dolphins arrived, and how big are groups of dolphins typically? So our resident group is approximately 120, and so they're about the same size. The White Sand Ridge is a little bit bigger, but that gives you more perspective. 50 dolphins coming into a group of 120 is a very significant increase. There's no good answer to your question about typical size. I would say if we were very broadly generalizing, 120 to 150 is pretty much it. But there are areas where it's a lot less, and there are areas where it can be more. Just depends on their resources.
As far as dolphin intelligence, and I think you said that dolphins you're studying like shallower water, so one might think that maybe they're not expending as much energy to go to the depths. And is there any correlation between relative intelligence and relative depth of habitation?
It's an interesting question. The question was, is there any relationship between the depth that the dolphins are going to regularly and their intelligence, their relative intelligence? Not that I know of. I think it's more likely that their relative intelligence is the complexity of their environment. So how complicated are things in their daily lives? What problem solving do they have to do? Most dolphin species, with the exception of big ones, will avoid the deep water unless they have to go there. There are some species who spend time in more murky waters and they live in much bigger groups so that they can have the benefit of a large group. It's harder to pick one individual out if you're 1,000. But I think it would be more likely to be the complexity. So it might, in some places, might be related. The complexity might also mean that the water is deeper, but I don't think that generally would apply. Yes?
Do they seek your boat, or do you seek them out?
question is, do the dolphins seek out our boat? That's a really good question. I am not sure. Some days it really does feel like it, because we will be out there for hours and hours, and all of a sudden they're right in front of us as though they heard us, and they're like, we're going to sneak up on them. But we have to assume that they are smart enough to recognize different boat sounds. And we go out there so often, and we go out there and put people in the water so often, that we can assume that they know what our boat sounds like, and that that boat puts people in the water. So I would guess that to some degree they will avoid us, but I'm not certain that they would seek us out. I would like to think that they would, but that's not very scientific of me. But if they're, they're having a rough day where there's a lot of conflict or something, they might not want to come see us. They'll just not be visible and swim away if they hear us coming.
They're not playful with you.
They are very playful, or they can be. The juveniles especially. Typically when we get in the water, and we have studied this to make sure that the data that we are using for their behavioral studies is representative of what they're doing when we're not there, and what they're doing at the surface, when they're socializing. So it's just a glimpse of their daily life. But after just a few minutes, any individuals that were coming up to see us will swim away, and they'll just keep doing whatever they were doing before. Sometimes the juveniles will come back and they'll be like, hey, did you see me? I did that cool thing. And they'll like zip by and they'll look at you like trying to get you to play with them. But, so yes, they are very playful with us.
Hi, does this work? This isn't working anyway. It is? Okay. Just talk. Oh, okay. So I'm really interested in what makes a particular social group behave more peacefully than more aggressively. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little more towards your observations or your theories about those interactions.
Yeah. So the question was, what would make a group be more peaceful? I suspect that part of the ability to be peaceful is that they have a pretty good life. They don't have to expend a lot of energy to go to look for food. They have a huge shallow area where they can rest. I'm assuming some of that area is better for resting than other areas, but it's not limited. So the ability to be more relaxed is part of it. They also have a huge area that allows them to access the deep water, so they don't need to fight over a small space to get there either. They also see a lot of things every day. So there's a ton of boats that come from Florida, and it's just noisy back and forth. There are cruise ships and everything. So probably some of that, they're used to a lot of commotion. So there are some dolphin species, like the ones that my advisor Richard Connor studies in Australia, where the bonds that are formed between males are so that they can be more successful in mating. So there'll be pairs or trios that will take a female and they'll keep her for a few hours to a few days so that they can mate with her, because otherwise they have to fight with all these other males instead of just cooperating with their little group of friends. We don't see that in the Bahamas. In fact, if you see them mating, you're lucky, because it happens so fast. Nobody is suffering for mating opportunities. So that's another thing. Yes?
Oh, me. Sure. I wanted to ask, I'm not quite sure where Bimini is, but wasn't it hit by a hurricane? At least the Bahamas was hit by a pretty significant hurricane. Would that have been around when you were doing your research?
Yes, so the question was, there was a hurricane, and would that have affected this weird event that we observed? They actually did look into that. So before, I think it was 2005, there was a sand obstacle. So in addition to the really deep channel, there was also kind of a physical obstacle that was washed away during the hurricane. But that was in 2005, and we didn't see the white sand ridge dolphins until 2013. So it's unlikely that that hurricane in particular, and they have hurricanes so frequently in the Bahamas that I would suspect that a hurricane would not have affected this unless it affected their prey availability or the amount of predators. Yes.
What does their diet consist of, and how many pounds will they eat in the course of the day?
So the question was what their diet consists of and how many pounds of fish they have to eat. The Bimini spotted dolphins primarily eat squid and schooling fish. The white sand ridge dolphins have been seen eating flying fish. If anyone is familiar, they're the ones that, as your boat is coming and makes a bow wake, they go woo, and they have like wings. So the fish that we've seen the spotted dolphins eat are also like long houndfish and eels that live in the sand. I am not certain how many pounds of it they have to eat though, because we've never actually, another interesting thing about Bimini is when an animal dies, it does not wash on land. So we can't do a necropsy and see anything about them. They just wash into the Gulf Stream. So I think that would be the only way we'd really be able to know.
Would they feed primarily in the Gulf Stream if they could?
Yes, they would feed in the Gulf Stream, yep. In fact, around Bimini, that shallow water is really, really clear. I'm sure you can imagine the Bahamas, where you can just see straight down and it's all sandy. There's not really anything there. You'll see one fish, a triggerfish swim by or something. The bottlenose will sometimes do what we call crater feeding. So they go along the sandy bottom and they are looking for something that indicates that there's an animal living under the sand. And then they'll stick their rostrum down and they'll kind of dig it out. But they have to do that for hours and hours and hours because they can only get one fish at a time. We don't really see the spotted dolphins doing that. We don't see them eating very much at all. More likely they will be playing with the fish. Last summer we saw, this anecdote it was so funny in the moment anyways. There was this one male and he was with a group of females and he had this huge mackerel. It was probably like this long. And he was just holding it right in the middle. And he was swimming around with it and it looked like he was presenting it. And every once in a while he would let one of the females take it and then he'd have it back and he'd just be swimming around like he was showing off. So they more often will be playing with the fish when we see them than eating them.
How do they communicate, and are there any in captivity?
How do they communicate and are there any in captivity? I'll answer the second part first. There are none. There used to be one who was a rescued spotted dolphin, but they don't thrive. So for an animal to be successful in captivity, they have to eat, sleep, and mate successfully, and spotted dolphins just don't. Like I said, the one that was there for the longest was a rescue who they couldn't release again. And how they communicate. So they have multiple methods of communication. When they're farther apart from each other, they'll use acoustic communication. Spotted dolphins more often will use whistles because the water's not very murky and the whistles can also go very far. In other areas like around England and Scotland where the water's much murkier, they're going to use burst pulses. It's echolocation, but in very, very, like a lot of echolocation in a short period of time. They use that for communication. But that's when they're far apart. Oftentimes, if dolphins are within sight of each other, they'll be very quiet. So when they're in sight, they use a lot of body positions, kind of like dogs. So they have different postures that mean different things. Swimming positions, so when dolphins really trust each other, they'll swim one above the other. And if you can imagine, just like any other animal, their belly is very sensitive, it's delicate, you have to trust someone to let them be that close to you, and they'll swim very calmly. They communicate to others about their own relationships in some ways as well. So again, Richard Connor's field site, they see females swimming next to each other just with their pectoral fin on the side of the other female. And it's just to show everybody that these two females are in a unit, like if you mess with one of us, you mess with both of us kind of thing. And then the communication that I study most is tactile communication. So mostly it's with their pectoral fins. Like primates will groom when they trust each other and to build and maintain relationships, dolphins will use their pectoral fins. They don't have hands, so they can't, if they have an itch or something, they can't get it. So they'll swim up to somebody else and they'll rub on them. But they also just play, so they're, communicating, this is fun. And then body rubs and stuff. Yeah? Yes?
Yeah, your spotted dolphins don't fight when they get together, but I heard Stephanie Gosda talk about her Florida bottlenose dolphins, and they cooperate in hunting. Do you ever see any cooperative behavior, either within each individual group or within the two different groups?
Yeah, so do we see cooperative behavior with the spotted dolphins? We don't, but that is only because we don't see them in a situation where they would need to cooperate. The white-sand ridge dolphins have also lived in an area with bottlenose dolphins, and the bottlenose there can be very aggressive. Since the spotteds are smaller, the juvenile males will practice their mating on any sex of spotted dolphin. So there they will cooperate to fight the bottlenose away. Around Bimini, the bottlenose aren't as aggressive, so they don't need to. They'll just kind of hang out and whenever they leave kind of thing. I do think that they will cooperate when they're in the deep water, either to get away from predators or to forage. I'm sure you've seen videos around South Africa where they have those huge schools of fish, and there's all the species that are like keeping the fish in a school, and then they take turns to go in and snatch fish. I imagine that is what their foraging looks like in the Gulf Stream at night. Yes? Yes?
So could you talk a little bit about the Bahamian government and outside research? I know that you told me a little bit about that it's gotten a little strained. Could you explain that briefly?
Sure. So the question was about the Bahamian government and scientific research. So this is the less exciting part of my talk. It starts as a nice thing. In 2020, the Bahamian government decided to follow I think it was the World Health Organization, a global organization decided that it was unfair for underdeveloped and developing nations that there wasn't better permitting for scientific research. And this is more for, they find an ingredient for a drug that then is sold for billions and billions of dollars. So it's a really good thing that we're thinking about. Prior to 2020, a permit to do research for a full year was $50, which, that was great for us, but the Bahamian government is not getting very much out of that. And that was the same for everybody, not just nonprofits. So in 2020, they decided to revamp it, and they made this portal, and they established an organization, a pair of people who were going to review the permits and make sure that everything was fair. They also added a lot more fees, so we pay per primary researcher, per graduate student, per undergraduate, different levels, but everyone has to pay. And then if you're a foreign organization that has land or like a research station or something, you have to pay for that research station as well. And they would do spot checks to make sure you're not lying, like keeping things in a freezer or something. The first year, the portal itself did not go great. So we did not get a research permit, but that was 2020. We didn't really expect things to go well. The next year, things did not get much better. Nobody got a permit. Last year, only a handful of research organizations got permits. So we have not had a research permit and have been unable to collect data since 2019. We are obviously allowed to go out on the boat as naturalists. There's nothing stopping us from just observing, but we're not able to collect the pictures that we need to keep track of the dolphins. We're not able to collect video data or acoustic data. And this isn't just us. The Shark Lab, which as I mentioned has been on Bimini since 1985 or something, They've been studying the lemon sharks around Bimini that entire time. They don't have research permits. Even Bahamian students who have gone to a university in the United States who are doing their research in the Bahamas have not gotten their research permits. So it's unclear exactly what the holdup is. In our case, it was kind of a technical, like a verbiage issue, because as I said, we pay per type of person, but there's no pay for a tourist. There's no way to submit an application for a tourist. So they said you're not allowed to have anybody but the boat crew and the researchers on the boat. And we just don't have the funding for that. So we can't go out on the boat in that type of situation. Yes.
First, your talk is fantastic.
Oh.
Absolutely. Have you been able to examine the effects of climate change or global warming?
So have we been able to examine the effects of climate change or global warming? We have not specifically looked into it, but it also hasn't really affected that area specifically besides hurricanes. The thing that has, though, is in 2014, they started the construction of a pier, a terminal for what they imagined was going to be this huge cruise ship-sized ferry that was going to come from Miami every single day, and it couldn't get into the harbor, so they had to build the pier. So for one entire summer, they had pile driving, and they dredged up a whole part of the reef, and for the next few years, the reef was so fuzzy, and the water clarity was horrible. So we decided to look at the influence of that on the dolphins, and we actually found that they didn't alter their behavior very much at all. And presumably that's because they don't forage much in that area, and they're mostly just traveling back and forth. But it definitely affected the reefs and the number of fish as well as the quality of the reef itself.
Can the bottlenose and the spotted dolphins communicate with each other?
Can the bottlenose and spotted dolphins communicate? I would say yes, for sure. So they definitely can visually communicate, and I would imagine that their sounds are pretty transferable. What we do not know is, you may have heard of signature whistles, where an individual has a whistle that they'll make as kind of like their name, their calling card. We know that our spotteds also have signature whistles to some degree. I don't know that the bottlenose would be able to recognize that type of thing. Yes?
I'm curious about broader implications of your research and whether there's even any philosophical ideas about what this might say about human behavior or anything else.
So the question was, what are the broader implications of this research? Which is a great question. I think about this a lot. I try not to be too hard on humans. But just imagine that you had your neighborhood established, and everybody had their house and had their grocery store and everything, and all of a sudden a group of people, half the size of the population that already lived there, just arrived and moved in without asking. We probably wouldn't react very well. And yes, we live in houses. I would hope that those people wouldn't just move into our houses, but these dolphins were just so peaceful. It does make you think, what are they doing that we should be better at? But like I said, we are a very complex species. Yes? Oh, there's one there.
Describe the shallow water and the deep water. Is the shallow water vulnerable at all to wind development? And what would that actually do?
So the question was, is the shallow area vulnerable to wind development? You mean like wind farms? Not that anybody has spoken about recently. I'm not sure that the Bahamas themselves would ever try to build there, but I could imagine that companies from outside the Bahamas might try. And the pier that I mentioned was built because there is a casino that was owned by a Malaysian company that couldn't get a permit to build in Miami, so instead they built in the Bahamas and then wanted to just ship their people over. So I imagine that if someone wanted to build a wind farm, that they would just have to give a certain amount of money and then they would be able to do it. It is sad. And you know what else? Can I just, sorry, I digress for a second. I study dolphins, yes, but I love all animals. I love the environment. I love everything. Bimini is 3 islands. There's South Bimini, North Bimini. North Bimini is where most people live. And then there's East Bimini, which nobody talks about. It's only mangroves, and it is the most beautiful place ever. It's magical. It is also the reason that Bimini has not blown away in all of these hurricanes. And the people at the casino would like to knock down all the trees in there and build a golf course. Which just kills me, because also you're investing all this money to build a golf course that's just gonna blow away in a hurricane. And everybody else is gonna blow away. And not only would the island blow away, but that's where all the conch are born, all the lobster, all the baby fish, the lemon sharks, all the, even like predatory sharks can be born there. It would just be devastating. Thank you for that, allowing me that.
One more question.
Yes.
Seems to me that if you have 120 spotted dolphin population and 50 more join them, how much population can they absorb?
That's a very good question. So
It seems like that would tax the area. And you haven't talked about that. You talked about how they manage to coexist, but wouldn't the 120 have grown bigger if they could have managed it?
yes, so the question was about carrying capacity, basically, that's what that's called. Whatever the environment can support. I do wonder about that, because as you were saying, the Bimini dolphins have been 120 approximately for as long as we've studied them, so presumably for as long as they've been there, which suggests that the area can support 120 spotted dolphins. I don't have evidence that some of the white sand ridge or Bimini dolphins moved back. We have not every year seen every single dolphin. It's possible that now that they have done this trip, they know that it's doable and they can go back and forth. Or maybe some of the white sand ridge dolphins were like, I don't like it here, and they went back. Or the Bimini dolphins said, we're going with you. So we have to do another population study to see if it has leveled off or if it has grown. Because it is unlikely that a population of 200 would just suddenly be okay. But like I was saying, it's a huge shallow bank, so they have lots of resting. And they have all the access to the deep water, which is just going to keep, it's the Gulf Stream, so it just keeps being replenished. So there's a chance that the carrying capacity didn't get any bigger because they can only have one calf at a time and there are only so many females, and I don't know. But it's a very good question. That's job security for me.
Thank you. Well,
Sorry.
Can't be too close to the speakers. Well, thank you, Nicole, that was fantastic. I was hoping that the Wheel of Fortune puzzle was going to say thank you for an excellent presentation. But it doesn't. I do want to let you know that our next presentation is Tuesday, March 7th. Beckett Colson, who is a mechanical engineer from the Nicole Oceanographic Institution, will be here to talk about a new tool for detecting ocean microplastics, which unfortunately maybe some of the spotted dolphins have ingested. Hopefully not, right? They have, of course they have. And we've made a mess of our food chains and food webs everywhere. Speaking of food chains and food webs, thank you for ordering food and drink tonight. Thank you for supporting the last round, and see you all again soon. Thanks for being here.